This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. Optimism abounds for a progressive agenda after President Obama's second inaugural address. Law professor Larry Gibson is a biographer of Thurgood Marshall and a Democratic campaign advisor in Maryland. He's optimistic that the president's re-election signals a more progressive vision for the United States. Our regular contributor, Fred Rotondaro of the Center for American Progress, says the president has learned he has to be tough as nails and will not have to compromise on hot-button Republican issues like the debt ceiling. And Bill Press talks with former Senate Democratic leader Tom Daschle, who's optimistic about the ability of the Senate to actually work. Are you tired of Tea Party Republicans and Rush Limbaugh dominating the airwaves? Do you want the facts you won't get on Fox or even on CNN? Then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Law professor Larry Gibson talks with us about his new biography of the young Thurgood Marshall and also about his optimism about the country as a result of President Obama's re-election. And we're joined now on americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats, by Larry Gibson, who's a law professor at the University of Maryland, prominent attorney in Baltimore, former Justice Department official in the Carter administration. And his new biography is of the first African-American Supreme Court justice, young Thurgood. It is the first one to win the approval of Thurgood Marshall's immediate family. Professor Gibson, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
It is my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
We appreciate your time with us. Thurgood Marshall, obviously the subject of your new book, is not exactly an unknown in American legal history. So why did you write this book, and what did you find out?
There are many books and other publications about Thurgood Marshall's full career, what he did. I decided that there needed to be a book about what he was like, about the person, about the forces that had shaped this man who then had such a dramatic impact on shaping the country. So that's what this book is about the environment, the people, and the events that had an impact on Thurgood Marshall during his formative years. The book only goes up until he is 30 years old.
Now, if you look at old pictures and film of Justice Marshall and see statues of him today, you know, one might think that he's very serious, almost godlike. But you reveal that he was also a man of great humor and maybe even a little bit of mischief. Tell us about that aspect of his life.
A part of what I learned, really beginning when I first met him, when I came to his house in the middle of the night in 1975, July of 1975, was that this sort of serious, almost humorless image of him that one would get from photographs was so inconsistent with the real person. I discovered that night and then explore in this book a man who was a gregarious person, quite a diplomatic person, a person who used politics a lot to accomplish his objectives, someone with a really fully developed sense of humor. And so that was part of what I wanted to accomplish here, is to present Thurgood Marshall, the man, and that's was what the goal was. And I think in the process, I will change people's image of him.
We're speaking with Larry Gibson, law professor at the University of Maryland. Of course, his new biography, Young Thurgood, talking about Thurgood Marshall up to the age of 30. What was it like to be a smart young lawyer in Baltimore in the 1930s? And what were some of the obstacles that Marshall faced?
Well, he started practicing right in the middle of the Depression. I mean, he became a lawyer in October of 1933. So it was a rough time for anybody economically, and certainly for a young lawyer. On the other hand, he had role models. And part of what I do in this book is describe his predecessors, there were really very influential African American lawyers who came ahead of him, who lived in Baltimore, who were role models for him not only stylistically but also as to the substantive agenda. If one were to look at the early cases that Thurgood Marshall brought to the Supreme Court after he became the chief counsel for the NAACP in 1938, so the period from 1938 to 1948, every one of those cases has some predecessor litigation that had occurred in Maryland. The cases involving criminal justice, housing, public accommodations, voting rights. And these predecessors were national leaders, but there was a core of them here in Baltimore. And so he was starting in the Depression, in the middle of the Great Depression, but he had predecessors and role models that he really sought to emulate, and in later years commented on as being guidance to him.
Was life any easier for blacks in Maryland because it was a border state and not part of the Deep South?
In Maryland, the situation was, I guess we would say, complicated. Blacks did not have the sort of freedoms that they had in the North, but on the other hand, there was not the overt type of racist treatment of the Deep South. And I think that this border state situation had a pretty much dramatic impact on Thurgood Marshall. The net result is that he sort of approached people on an individual basis rather than drawing conclusions based on their race. He certainly experienced discrimination like all blacks did, but he, from his childhood forward, met many decent white people, and many of whom became long-term mentors of him. I think he ultimately concluded that there were some decent and bright judges in Maryland, and he began, once he became a lawyer, to bring cases and to succeed on racial matters. And some of these cases became precedents that then had impacts around the nation. So this was the quintessential border state, frequently called Maryland, frequently called the most southern northern state and the most northern southern state. And it left its impact on Thurgood Marshall.
Now, what were some of Marshall's early successes in the battle to end segregation in schools and elsewhere? Did he have to fail much in order to succeed?
Marshall's first two cases dealing with school desegregation was first a success and then a failure. The first step on the road to Brown versus Board of Education, according to historians, was the University of Maryland Law School case that Thurgood Marshall brought in 1935 in his third year as a lawyer. It was the first time that any judge in the country ordered the desegregation of an educational facility. That was a success. The next year, however, was also his first failure. It was his first lawsuit in an effort to desegregate a high school. Baltimore County surrounds Baltimore City, and Baltimore County had 10 high schools at that time, but African Americans in Baltimore County could not attend any of them. They had to travel several miles and come into Baltimore City to attend the one colored high school. That was the name of the school, later Douglas High School, in Baltimore City. Marshall brought in 1936, the year after he won the law school case, a suit that was sought to desegregate the high schools, or at least get blacks into one of the high schools in Baltimore County, and he lost that. Those were his first two cases. Now, the third matter, still he addressed while in Maryland, but it straddled his going to the NAACP, were the teacher pay cases. African American teachers in Maryland and throughout the South were paid substantially less than white teachers with comparable credentials and experience, roughly about 50%. And Thurgood Marshall began in Maryland lawsuits challenging those practices. He had his initial successes in Maryland, and then later, after he joined the NAACP, for a period of about 7 years, he brought similar lawsuits in about 10 states. And now these were very important because they dramatically increased the income of the largest professional group in the most black communities, namely the school teachers. So he had, but even there, in his early litigation in Maryland, he won some and he lost some.
And to think of the time when he's doing this is just it's pretty outstanding that he had successes, quite frankly. But anyway, now before we let you go, Professor Gibson, and since this is a netcast for progressive Democrats, and since you have a long history as a party activist in your state, tell us where you think Democrats are headed nationally. Is the re-election of Barack Obama the high point, or are there hazards down the road? What do you think as we move forward?
Well, I'm quite optimistic. I think the re-election of Barack Obama signaled the country making a decision that it was going to be more progressive and was not going to go backwards and become reactionary. It was, I think, the crossroad at which the country had to make a decision. And I think it made a decision, and I'm pleased with the decision it made. I don't see how we get back to the dangerous posture we were in just a few months, a few weeks of the country going back in the area of its treatment of people, of women, of minorities, of persons who are disabled, biases being acted out in law as it relates to gender and sexual preference. I don't see how that progressive decision that the whole country made gets reversed, and so I'm quite optimistic.
Well, and we can hope that your optimism is a look to fruition for this country. Larry Gibson is a law professor at the University of Maryland. His new biography of the first African-American Supreme Court Justice, Young Thurgood. Professor Gibson, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org. We look forward to speaking with you again soon.
My pleasure. Thank you.
You're quite welcome. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future and help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up, commentator Fred Rotondaro is optimistic that President Obama will hold the line on Social Security and Medicare. But right now, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
Given his own cool reserve and his first-term penchant for pursuing a tepid middle-right governing agenda, I didn't expect to get much warmth from Barack Obama's inaugural address. I was surprised. In his speech, the re-elected president actually showed some FDR jut-jawed presidential flair. Rooting his address in America's solid progressive values, he issued a call for the great majority of our people, the middle class and the poor, to join him in a nationwide campaign to rebuild our country's infrastructure, our ladder of upward mobility, and, most importantly, our sense of shared purpose. Predictably, right-wing pundits and defenders of the corporate order decried his speech as partisan and socialist. But in fact, the best word to characterize the speech is simply American. It was a straightforward restatement of the grassroots principles that the founders first articulated. It's no accident that his most used phrase 5 times was "we the people," the opening words of the remarkably progressive preamble to our nation's founding document. We the people still believe that every citizen deserves a basic measure of security and dignity, Obama reminded us. We do not believe that in this country freedom is reserved for the lucky or happiness for the few. The commitments we make to each other through Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security, these things do not sap our initiative, they strengthen us. They do not make us a nation of takers, they free us to take the risks that make this country great. This is Jim Hightower saying, at this difficult juncture in America's long and uncertain journey toward egalitarianism, when powerful forces of elitism are trying to push our society down the dark alley of plutocracy, this was the speech we needed. Read it for yourself at www.whitehouse.gov/blog/inaugural address.
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. In the glow of President Obama's second inaugural address, regular commentator Fred Rotondaro says the American public is behind him, and the president has learned to be tough as nails. Fred also has a reminder for American Catholics about a recent message from the Pope. And joining us now on americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats, regular commentator Fred Rotondaro not only is a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress and a contributor to the Huffington Post, he's also active in the lay Catholic community, especially on social issues. And Fred joins us again today on americasdemocrats.org. Fred, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me back, Jim.
Great to speak with you as always. Are you optimistic that President Obama and the Democratic Senate can hold the line and protect Medicare and Social Security against the Republican naysayers?
Yeah, I really am. I think President Obama learned a lot in his first 2 years as president, and the biggest thing he learned is that the Republicans aren't going to give him an inch, and he's just got to be tough as nails. He learned it. I think he's going to continue being that way throughout his second term.
On January 1st, a number of states raised their minimum wage. Is that going to have any real effect on the economy or just for the lowest paid workers?
It's going to help a little bit because the people who get minimum wage and have a few bucks more, they're going to go out and spend it. That will help the economy. But there's got to be a lot more than that. I'm a firm believer in the fact that the economy is in a slow recovery because the middle class wages over the course of the last really 20 years have been pretty stagnant, and that middle class needs better jobs, better wages. Middle class gets money, they go out and they spend the money, and in spending the money they stimulate the economy. Corporations don't do it. The upper 1-2% don't do it. They do it to suit their convenience. And sometimes their convenience is just putting the money away, letting it grow, or investing it overseas.
And yet we continue to see attempts to what basically amounts to shrinking the middle class.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I think these attempts have been going on for 25 or 30 years. And you can see them. You can see them through a variety of things that corporations have done with total cooperation from the Republican Party. I think attacks on labor unions. Labor unions are now, or labor membership is now at its lowest percentage of the workforce in something like 50 or 60 years. You also had corporate influence demonstrated in such things as laws that help corporations to move in and do away with middle-class pension guarantees. You've got a whole variety of things that have taken place that have kept middle-class wages very, very stagnant, while the wages of CEOs have literally gone through the roof. I'm quoting from memory now, and my memory may be a little bit off, but somewhere around 1980, the average CEO earned something like 40% more than a worker who was in the factory, who worked for him. Today, that percentage is something like 420 times more than the average worker. Over the last 3 decades, the upper class corporate CEOs, stockholders have gotten an incredible amount of benefits from the government, while the middle class has just been held in check.
We're speaking with Fred Rotondaro, Senior Fellow at the Center for American Progress, a contributor to the Huffington Post, and, of course, regular commentator here on americasdemocrats.org. Less noticed, perhaps, was another January 1st event, Fred, a papal homily in which Pope Benedict said the world needs economic reforms and regulations to close the gap between rich and poor. Do you think anyone heard that in Washington or anywhere else, for that matter?
People. Not enough people. I do know that the Pope sent that homily sometime in mid-December, I think it was December 14th, to world leaders. So he is going out there and he is going to push it. The organization I'm connected with, Catholic, it's an Alliance for the Common Good, we're promoting the idea, and I know other Catholic groups aren't. I'm usually rather angry at the United States Catholic Conference of Bishops because, to the best of my knowledge, they're not doing anything to promote this, and they should be. The Pope talked about being about unbridled capitalism being virtually a form of terror conducted against the middle class and against poor people. And this is a message that needs to be heard. It's not being heard nearly as much as it should be. But lay Catholics like myself, as well as lay members of other religions, are going to be promoting this message. Should point out, this isn't the first time Pope Benedict has done this. In 2010, he issued an encyclical on charity that spread the same basic idea that inequality is a moral evil, and to the best we can, we must remedy this.
What kinds of things can those in the church be doing to help this along? This almost, you make it almost sound like the Pope's being ignored when he's saying these things if nobody's acting on it.
He is. The Pope is being ignored, and I put the blame at the U.S. Catholic Conference of Bishops. Example, right after John Boehner was elected as Speaker of the House in 2011, we had the horrible Ryan budget that decimated low-income people in this country. Boehner was elected in January, and in May he was given an honorary doctorate by Catholic University, which is, of course, controlled by the Catholic bishops. Paul Ryan, who put together that horrible budget, I think it was not only horrible in the sense of how it hurt low-income and middle class, but it didn't even balance the budget. I mean, it wouldn't have balanced the budget until the year 2140. Ryan is a friend from Milwaukee days of Cardinal Terrence. Oh my God, I forget his name.
There's that memory thing creeping up on you again.
It's that memory thing. I tell you, as the Italians say, getting old isn't for sissies. But in any case, the cardinal who heads the U.S. Catholic Conference of Bishops, after the budget came out, said Paul Ryan is a wonderful public servant, and never said one thing about that budget. In effect, when the Catholic cardinals and when bishops go out and praise Republican conservatives who are promoting concepts or ideas that hurt low-income people, they are saying it's okay to do this. They're giving the imprimatur to Catholic and to other religious voters that this isn't something you should worry about. And they are, in effect, ignoring the Pope.
Okay. Now, do you think President Obama was wise to tell the nation that he will, under no circumstances, compromise on the national debt ceiling debate? And do you think he'll have to?
I think it was probably a good move, and I don't think he's going to have to because he's really got the upper hand. The public is completely with him, and in order for the Republicans to get their way, they're going to have to make very severe cuts or attempt to make very severe cuts, in areas such as Medicare and Social Security. Public isn't going to be with them on this. We've got to remember one very important thing, I think, Jim, and that is that Republicans have been losing general elections. Republicans have lost the popular vote for president 4 out of the last 5 elections. And yet, by this created, and I call it created, debt crises, they're winning the battle of public policy. They're cutting back on social programs. They're cutting back on the safety net. They're cutting back on programs like, obviously, when I say social programs, Medicare, Medicaid, and such. They're doing that because they say we can't tolerate this debt. But oh, by the way, we won't vote to cut to raise corporate taxes or even to close loopholes. We won't vote in any way to raise taxes on the very, very wealthiest. Remember, the Republicans, even in the first 2 days of this session, in voting for $9 billion, which would be a down payment for victims of Hurricane Sandy, it would go to pay for the insurance coverage that those victims of Hurricane Sandy paid for. 67 Republicans voted no. 67 House Republicans voted no. Mm-hmm. Representative Peter King, who is a very strong Republican, conservative, coming from New York, said, if I were a voter in this town, I might not give any more money to Republicans. Al D'Amato, who I knew when he was in town, a very tough, old-fashioned conservative Republican, referred to his fellow conservative Republicans voting against giving aid to Sandy victims as, quote, jackasses, unquote.
Well put. I mean,
I think Al was right, as he often is.
Hit that one on the head is what he did.
Yes, he did.
Changing it up a little bit, what's your outlook on the chances, Fred, for any meaningful gun control legislation this year or next?
I am extraordinarily hopeful, but I know how difficult it is. This is a very complex topic. One thing people don't remember is that there's an incredible amount of money that goes into gun manufacturers, in the low billions in profits. Places like Walmart make vast hundreds of millions, in the billions, selling guns. ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, which is a coalition of conservative businesses, have been putting a lot of money into this. On top of that, you've got an awful lot of gun advocates in this country who have been whitewashed, who have been brainwashed in no uncertain manner. I've been engaging on social media with some of these people, and they talk about, you can't take away my liberty. It's in the Second Amendment that I have a right to an assault weapon. Well, what about 20 kids dying? They don't use the term collateral damage, but that's really what they're saying. Some of these people are talking about they're the inactive militia, and they need guns, they need assault weapons to fight the tyranny of the government. Putting it bluntly, some of these people are living in another century. They have no understanding of, nor do they wish to have an understanding of 21st century America. But sadly, you've probably got 35 to 40% of the public out there who think that their right to have an assault weapon is a fundamental, guaranteed American constitutional right. They have been brainwashed. They've got to be brought along to some recognition of moderation. It's going to be tough, but I think it can be done for one simple reason: 20 kids. I mean, I Jim, was like a lot of progressives. I'm for gun control, I'm for gun safety, but I didn't pay a lot of attention to it. Didn't really check the facts, knew a few facts. That Friday morning a month ago really woke me up, and I hope and pray it woke tens of millions of Americans up as well.
In fact, there were some notable folks that have changed their opinion about gun legislation and what needs to be done on the right, that have said, You know what, I got to rethink this now because this should never have happened.
Yeah, at the very least, America has more guns per member of the population than any country in the world. It is totally ridiculous. It's something like 87 guns for every 100 members. We're not going to do away with handguns. We're not going to do away with rifles. But the thought that mad people, when I say mad people, that's a very bad term, mentally unbalanced people can have such easy access to what are, in effect, machine guns, assault weapons, and that somebody like this young man, Lanza, can get a gun like this from his mother, shoot her, and then walk into a classroom and kill 20 young first graders is so against any concept of morality, so against any concept of rationality, that I think we have to get some kind of gun safety right now. Joe Biden's the right man. If anybody can do it, Joe Biden can, and I think he will make some pretty important steps this month when he gives his final report.
Fred Rotondaro, Senior Fellow at the Center for American Progress, contributor to the Huffington Post, and, of course, regular commentator here on americasdemocrats.org. Fred, as always, it was a pleasure speaking with you. We look forward to speaking with you again soon.
Thank you, Jim. It's always a pleasure.
Thank you. Take care. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future to keep this show on the air and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. And now, Bill Press and his guest, Tom Daschle, former majority leader, who talks about his optimism for the Senate despite little progress on ending filibusters.
We start out this hour with another really good friend, a great leader for this nation, a former Senate Majority Leader, Tom Daschle, who has a new book out, actually, all about the United States Senate and how it works, and it worked a lot better when he was there than it is today, I think. Senator Daschle, good to talk to you.
Well, thank you, Bill. Good to be with you. Good morning to both you and Lynn.
Good morning.
Yeah, welcome back. So how do you, with your perspective, Senator, looking now in your book, The Fundamentals of American Government, the United States Senate, how do you think it's working or not working today?
Well, you know, it's working in some degree beyond what most people would really fully appreciate. If you look at what happened in the 111th Congress bill, I mean, they accomplished a good deal. Healthcare reform, Dodd-Frank, Don't Ask, Don't Tell, treaties on trade. It's just an amazing array. And yet the perception is nothing gets done. This last couple of years, unfortunately, have been a lot more contentious, a lot more polarized, a lot more confrontational. Just a tremendous number of cloture votes. So there are times when you can look at what they've done and be somewhat pleased and satisfied, and other times when you know a lot more could be done and we have to strive to do more.
Right.
Well, do you think that the Senate, I want to just jump into this changing the filibuster rule, which is the current news right now. Do you predict that it will be changed, and how will it impact the legislation that goes through the Senate?
And should it be changed, if I may jump
in,
too?
Should it? What do you think?
Well, here's what I would do. I hear you and I've talked about it, and I don't mean to talk out of school, but I think there are two things that we used to do. You know, we had 137 filibusters, I think, in the last Congress, and 113 and 137 in the Congress before that. But from 1917 to 1967, we had 45. And so, you know, a huge difference. We had twice as many in 2 years than we had in 50 in that period of time. But we did two things. One, we went into what we call a dual-track system, where if there was a filibuster, we set the bill aside and moved on to another bill until the bill so-called ripened. And then we went to triple track and quadruple track and quintuple track. And so we got to go back to single track. We ought to say, okay, you're going to have a filibuster. We're going to stay on this bill this nomination until it gets done. That's one thing that changed, and it changed in the 80s. The second thing we did was we gave up the requirement that people had to hold the floor.
Yes.
So you can now technically filibuster and not pay a price whatsoever. And I think the time has come to say, okay, you want to filibuster? Number one, we're going to call you out. Number two, we're going to stay on this nomination or bill. And number three, you got to hold the floor for days if you think it's that important.
Yeah.
And if we would do those two things, I think we'd go back to the record we had from 1917 to 1967.
Yeah, bring back Strom Thurmond, right?
Absolutely,
or
27
bring back,
hours.
what is the movie, that famous movie with the
Mr. Smith Goes to Washington.
Yes,
yeah.
Make him. So do you think, from what you know, that the rule will be changed and the negotiations will work out?
Well, I think Senator Reid and Senator McConnell have worked out, or I shouldn't say they have worked out. I think they're working on trying to get an agreement on modification, especially on, you can actually filibuster a bill twice. You can filibuster a bill on the what's so-called motion to proceed, that is, whether you should even take up the bill.
Right.
And then you can filibuster again, well, actually 3 times. Then you can filibuster once you're on the bill, and you can filibuster an amendment to the bill. So, what they're working on, as I understand it, and I haven't talked to Senator Reid about this, as I understand it, they're taking away one of the motions on the motion to proceed. You couldn't filibuster on that. That's a start. But as I say, I'm not even sure rules changes are important as going back to the old practices we had when the system really worked.
Yeah, it's that motion to proceed, I think, which is the one that bugs people the most, because you can't even get to the point of an up or down vote, right?
That's right.
Yeah,
That's
which
right.
seems particularly unfair.
Well, up and down votes are something that I think that's one of the myths of how Congress works. We know the House rarely has an up or down vote because of the majority rule that often is imposed.
The Hastert rule.
And even in the Senate, I mean, Senator, wouldn't you think most people would be surprised if they realized how few up and down votes there really are in the House and Senate?
Well, especially in the last couple of years, Len, it's been remarkably. I think it set a new record for recent history. I think you have to go all the way back to the 40s to find a time when so little legislation actually was enacted. And so you're right. I mean, this has not been a very productive couple of years, and hopefully that'll change this time.
Senator Tom Daschle is our guest. He has a new book out, published by our good friend Tom Dunn from St. Martin's Press in New York. We have the same publisher and a good friend of ours. His new book is The U.S. Senate, basically how it works or how it doesn't work. I want to ask you, Senator, about I do agree with you that the Senate particularly, which used to be kind of perceived, I think, as the slower body where not much got done, has accomplished more than the House was able to in the last few years. Look, it was the Senate that first passed the bill giving 98% of Americans a tax cut, right? And that was a bipartisan measure. So, but do you see a lack of willingness to work together, work across the aisle? That was the rule when you were majority leader.
Well, there is a good deal of that. Unfortunately, I think the bigger problem, Bill, is that you've got this almost polar existence between the House and the Senate right now. You've got the House that is led in large measure by the Tea Party, and then you've got the Senate that, in many respects, is not much different from what it has been. Although you've got a few very, very vocal, extraordinarily conservative members who are attempting to do to the Senate what has been done to the House. And so, and of course, one senator can hold up everything. Rand Paul does a pretty good job of it these days, and others like him. And so it's still much more polarized than it should be. But on a second level, very quietly, somewhat clandestinely, you hear. In fact, I get reports frequently from my former colleagues about meetings going on and little rump groups starting and gangs of 6 or 5 or 2 or something, always working on issues. So there is sort of an encouraging undercurrent that that I think is only happening in the Senate. I never hear that happening in the House.
Well, could part of that be it's just smaller? I mean, we have a gang working right now in immigration reform.
Right.
That's going. I think it's a gang of 6. It's usually even numbers. Otherwise, I guess the group can't work. You had it on debt issues. So is that? Do you think it's just because the chamber is more collegial, or it's just smaller and people know each other, or people have the security of a 6-year term that they could do some longer term planning? is it the chemistry, the DNA of a Senate that makes it different, where you can have these rump gangs try to do stuff?
I think it's all of the above. What concerns me, and I made mention of this a couple of times in other venues, but what troubles me is that it's now custom for House members, when they get elected, to leave their families in their states and their districts, and not to move them to Washington. When I got elected way back in '78, everybody moved their families to Washington because they were family. Well, now you don't do that. Now you leave them in your district, and you leave on Thursdays, you come back on Tuesdays, and you're supposed to run the country on Wednesdays, and unfortunately, you never get to know who you're running it with. And so, but in the Senate, because it's a longer term, there's less of that. There is still some of that. Some new senators still have their families in their states. But I think it's that longer term, that opportunity really to get to know everybody in the institution a little bit more. And, I think, and there has been a tremendous turnover. My number in the Senate was 1776, a number I'm very proud of. But there's now, the latest number is 1945. So just since I was there, we've had almost 200 new members of the Senate. And that undermines, I think, the ability, that rapid turnover, the ability of people to work together.
Now, Senator, finally, I've got to ask you, again, we're talking with former Senator Tom Daschle from North Dakota, author of the new book, The U.S. Senate, just out, published by St. Martin's Press and Thomas Dunn Books. Senator, we remember when we overlapped for a little while there at the Center for American Progress, and you were often in studio with us at the Center. I remember you were the first one to come in and endorse Barack Obama for president. You did that on our program. And whenever you came in, Senator, you're always accompanied by a young man we got to know and love by the name of Dennis McDonough. So is he going to be the next chief of staff for President Obama, and do you think he's up to the job?
Well, you've got a great memory, and you're exactly right, Bill. He and I would trudge in together, and I was inclined to give him the microphone half the time, because he could certainly handle it. I think he will be. I can't certainly speak officially for the administration, but I think it's very likely that sometime this week we're going to get that announcement. And I must say, I think he'll do a phenomenal job. He is somebody I had the good fortune to work with for many, many years, and he's very smart. He's very, he's got an amazing relationship with the president. He knows the Hill. He worked with Lee Hamilton on the House side and then with me in the Senate, and now in the White House, and he's got a great network, so he's got all the makings, I think, of a really, really good chief of staff.
Well,
also, as we say, from your lips to God's ears, Senator, right?
And also, I mean, maybe the listeners don't know that it's Senator, some of your key staffers who went over to then Senator Obama's office are still in the White House, and another one is Pete Rouse, who was your chief of staff, who went on to become Senator Obama's chief of staff, and who has been a top White House advisor.
That's right. I'm still impressed that he takes my calls.
So you think the chief of staff announcement is going to come this week?
I think so.
Is that an informed guess?
I'll just leave it at that, Lynn. But I think it's going to be good news regardless.
Senators, thank you. So congratulations on the new book, The U.S. Senator, Senator Tom Daschle.
Thanks so much for having me.
Hey, great to connect with you again, Senator. All right. Best to you and to Linda, too. 866-55-PRESS is our toll-free number. Lynn Sweet in studio with us from Chicago Sun-Times. I think we just made a little news there, folks. Yes, Senator Tom Daschle predicting this week. That means today or tomorrow, Lynn.
I'm aware. I've taken note.
Announcement of the new chief of staff of the White House, Dennis McDonough. You heard it here first.
That's all for AmericasDemocrats.org. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Larry Gibson, Fred Rotondaro, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to AmericasDemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook. For AmericasDemocrats.org, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the show and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to America's